Podcast Deep Explorer to the USSM Cluny. Slick Podcast Deep Explorer to the USSM Cluny. Are you receiving? Over.
This is Acting Captain Morgan of the United States Submarine George Clooney, receiving you loud and clear.
Captain Morgan, are the teams I requested assembled and ready to join us down here? Over.
Affirmative, Slick Control. The British SBS team are now aboard and are being briefed by Jared Murphy. But, sir, I must voice my concern.
I understand your concerns, Captain, but my podcast needs more listeners and subscribers. We need to secure and open this artifact. Give the order and bring Jared and his team down here. Over.
Yes, sir. Understood. More listeners and subscribers needed.
Now hear this. This is the captain. Secure the boat and prepare to dive.
Aye, sir. Chief of the watch, sound the dive alarm. Pass the word along to 1MC. Open the main ballast tank vents.
Aye, sir. Passing the word. Dive. Sir, main ballast tank vents indicate open.
Aye, both planes dive. 15 degrees. Dive 15 degrees.
You have tuned in for a Slick Podcast. I'm here to seek the truth. Live from Scotland around the UK. The one and only Slick Podcast. Enjoy the show. Can I ask important questions? No matter how bizarre the truth might be. Tune in for Slick Podcast, keeping it real, keeping it groovy.
Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, or a very good day to you when and wherever you're listening from, and a very warm welcome to the show. I'm your host, Simon Laurie King. Coming up on today's show, one of my favourite genres of fiction and everyday ponderance is that of time travel. I've just finished an excellent book titled How to Build a Time Machine, The Real Science of Time Travel. My guest today is science-backed writer Brian Clegg, and his book, I can tell you, was a real workout for my mind. I've always thought about the possibility of travelling in time and the mischief I'd probably undertake or accidentally get myself into. And this does not include killing my grandfather, or anybody in fact. I've asked a couple of my previous guests about where they would go and what they would do if given the opportunity. My list would include the building of Henge and the pyramids. Oh, and not forgetting the whole out of Africa thing as also. And so the list goes on. Speaking to Brian will, I've no doubt, be an education. Brian's extremely busy and his lectures and book writing fills his own time completely. We are, however, fortunate that he has made himself available for us today. So without further delay, it's my absolute pleasure to welcome Brian Clegg to the show.
Thanks very much.
Let's get the ball rolling on this one.
I have to state for my listeners that the book we'll be discussing here today would be impossible to explore in its entirety, as the subject matter and material contained is huge. After having read it and thoroughly enjoyed it myself, I would definitely encourage any of my listeners to read it also. I'm certain that you'll be very glad you did. Brian, you have written over 40 books on the sciences alone, covering a wide range of subjects: mathematics, quantum and classical physics, and one of my favourites, and which we'll be speaking about here today, time travel. You have also written about the beginnings of our journey as a species into the inquisitive questioning that began our search for those answers, about our realm and in turn bedrocked our modern science today in your book titled Scientifica Historia. The list impressively goes on: biographical books on Einstein and Nikola Tesla, and not forgetting your fictional books, which are also very popular with your readership. If that wasn't enough, you have written many books on business, and through these books, the tools needed to navigate and successfully achieve confidence in such matters. Your books also include The Non-Fiction Agent. This, I have to say, is proof of the pudding. You clearly outlined the steps needed to have one's book noticed and published, And because of the amount of books you yourself have successfully published, I believe this book to be essential reading for the aspiring author. Brian, what is it that appeals to you so much about, in broad terms, science? And what fires the passion you obviously have for writing about its many guises, isms, and disciplines?
I think there's two things happening here, really. One is I have an enthusiasm for writing, as you say. It goes even beyond the science. So I've written business books in the past. I love writing detective fiction and also science fiction. So it's writing itself is something I just love doing. But my education was in science. I've always found science itself fascinating. And I think the reason for that is it's kind of a sense of wonder really about the universe. It's about finding out more about what's out there, how our universe works, how we fit in it. And it's interesting. I do a lot of talking in schools. And when you talk to children in junior schools, they all love science. They're all really excited by science. Now, for some reason, when we get to about 12, 13, it is no longer cool somehow to be interested in stuff. But some of us managed to stay interested and have that excitement. And I think that stayed with me for all my life.
Your book, How to Build a Time Machine, The Real Science of Time Travel, I have to say, gave my brain a complete workout and is definitely on the small list of must-read again books that I have. This subject has always fascinated me, as I'm sure it does everyone. The first revealing fact that I learned from your book was that time travel, according to the laws of physics and leading academics, past and present, Professor Stephen Hawking, Albert Einstein, and many others mentioned in your book, is in fact certainly possible. Could you outline what is meant by time travel being possible and sort out fictitious media presented insights from science actuality?
Well, we all love time travel in science fiction, and it's great fun. But there it's quite simple. You just travel, set where you're going, somehow magically travel into the future or travel into the past. It is possible in the real world. Physics says that you can do it, and practical experiments have shown that you can do it. But it's a lot more complicated, shall we say, than it is in the stories. So traveling into the future and traveling to the past are totally separate things. It's much easier to get into the future. In a sense, we all do that all the time. We just wait a few seconds and we're into the future. But you want to go faster than that, and that is also possible. The thing that came out of Einstein's remarkable special theory of relativity is that time and space are linked together. And when you move through space, you also move through time. And the faster you move through space, the more impact it has on your time relative to somewhere else. So that's moving into the future. That's something we can do. The best time machine we have so far, a probe called Voyager 1 that went out in the 70s, not intended to be a time traveler, but it has moved about 1.1 seconds into the future in the time it's been traveling. Going into the past is a lot more complicated, but in principle, it's possible. The physics says it could be done. The practicalities, however, are rather different.
And the engineering, I should imagine, is way, way beyond what we have at the moment. It entails all of the physics, quantum physics, classical physics. It's just mind-boggling what it would undertake to do such a thing. We are nowhere near that at the moment.
Oh, that's right. I mean, broadly speaking, the ways of traveling into the past certainly would require the ideas like being able to manipulate stars, being able to move stars around and do things with them. So, an engineering feat that's totally beyond our current capabilities. Going to the future, as I say, is easier. It's just a matter of traveling fast. The faster you can get a spaceship going, the more it will travel into the future. So that's the one, if you like, that's the relatively easy one in terms of current technology, though even there, getting up to speeds relatively near the speed of light, which ideally you want to do to be able to travel quickly into the future, are difficult. Traveling to the past, though, it requires engineering that is almost impossible to imagine how you could practically do it at the moment.
Your book contains a number of thought experiments. I understand these to be logic applied to a problem where physical experimentation cannot be applied due to engineering impossibilities or such like. a thought experiment I've had for many years is the question of time and space. Space in this case being both uses of the word. If, for instance, let's say I had a railway track that was 100 miles in circumference, hanging in space outside our atmosphere, and a train going around at 186,000 miles per second, would time slow down for those on the train compared with those on Earth, whose time you quote in the book as the future approaching velocity of 1 second per second? Or would the train have to travel in a linear direction, in a straight line, to achieve the effects of traveling at the speed of light?
Thought experiments are something that Albert Einstein particularly was fond of, and they're really just a way of playing around with the idea of physics, not necessarily even when you can't do it. Einstein just wasn't interested in experimenting, frankly. But so when you're thinking about something like your incredibly fast train, obviously that is very much a thought experiment. The simple answer is yes, it would work. It would slow time down. The more complicated answer is that it's not quite a case of saying time slows down for the people on the train, because this is all about relativity. So as far as the people on the train were concerned, nothing would seem to be different. Time would just seem to flow normally as far as they're concerned. But if they then came back to Earth, they would find that they would have moved into the future of Earth. You wouldn't have to be going at near the speed of light. You can't actually travel at the speed of light. That's a limit that you can't get up to. But you don't have to go that fast. Any movement will do that. And in fact, the GPS satellites we use for satellite navigation, because they are moving around the Earth, do have this relativity effect. And as a result of that, time, if you like, slows down for them, which is a problem because they are very sensitive clocks. That's how GPS works. Interestingly, there is actually another effect because the gravity is less up in space, and reducing gravity means actually it has the reverse effect. And as it happens, that overwhelms the time slowing down effect. So the drift would actually be the other way. But if we didn't correct for that, if we didn't correct for the relativistic time travel of the GPS satellites, they would go out in terms of location by several miles a day. So this is a real thing. It doesn't need 186,000 miles per second. Even just the speed of an ordinary satellite, we do have to correct for its time traveling effects.
So distance for the imaginary train in the thought experiment of mine would be inconsequential. It's the speed to have the effect of time slowing down as far as the people on Earth to the returning people coming back off the train. It wouldn't be distance, it's the speed.
That's right. It's for speed and for how long you do it. So basically what's happening is as something is moving, when seen from somewhere else, where it's moving with respect to, if we look at that thing, so looking from Earth to your train or to a satellite, we will see clocks going slower on the train or on the clock satellite from Earth. And because of that, when they can then come back to Earth, what we find is they've effectively moved into the future. And it's just for how fast they're going and how long they do it before they come back.
So how long unchecked would the satellites, in your opinion, be out of sync, the maximum? Is it only a couple of seconds and it couldn't achieve any more than that?
Well, it's a fraction of a second. But the point is, as I say, that it doesn't take a lot, because with the GPS satellites, we're talking about them, we're down to, millionths of a second in accuracy. And the importance is that it is just moving a little bit. But as I mentioned, in fact, actually, as it happens, the drift is in the opposite direction with them, because the gravitational effect is actually stronger than the movement effect. So there's two different aspects of relativity, both of which affect the way time flows, if you like. And it happens in their case that it's the being in less gravity means that effectively time is actually going slightly faster on the satellites than it is on the surface of the Earth.
Could that effect be useful in engineering a time machine? The observation of it and why it's happening, could that be useful in constructing said time machine? Theoretically, anyway.
It's hard to say how there could be anything practical, simply because, it is a very, very tiny fraction of a second. It's just possible in terms of some kind of, if you have some communications issue that was very dependent on absolute timing, and had some very small effect, would still have an impact, then it's possible. But on the whole, it's not something that has a practical use. It's just something we have to be aware of with the GPS satellites, so that they don't drift and suddenly find ourselves several miles away from where we think we should be.
Could you describe a couple of examples how time travel could be achieved if our engineering was capable of approaching this goal? To my understanding, having read some of the presenting the hypothesis in this book, the engineers would regularly be unscrewing the rusted bolt of impossibility and replacing it with a shiny new probability. One theoretical feat, which you've touched upon, of engineering that comes to mind from your book is the rotating neutron star cylinder.
Yeah, okay. So really, again, there are two ways we have to think. There's going into the future and going into the past. So going into the future, all you need is a very fast spaceship, go out there for a length of time, come back, and you'll find you've moved into the future compared to the Earth. And the faster you can go, the longer you can go, the more you're going to do that. So there we're looking at ways of getting a spaceship up to high speeds. The same sort of problem that people are looking at when they're thinking about traveling to other stars. That if you were to do that, you do need to get up to a reasonable fraction of the speed of light to be able to make those journeys, bearing in mind that, the nearest star is over 4 light years away. So that light itself takes 4 years to make that journey. The ship would have to go, a reasonable fraction of that to get there in any time. Then you're also getting some interesting moving into the future effects. When it comes to moving to the past, as I've said, the engineering is remarkable. The simplest way of doing that in theory is this neutron star cylinder. The idea is you need to get yourself a few neutron stars, collect them together, make them into a cylinder, and spin it around very quickly. And if you do that, because the neutron star is so dense, it produces such a strong gravitational field that the effects of general relativity, which is Einstein's other theory, where mass influences space and time around it. The rotating cylinder effectively drags space and time around with it, a bit like if you turn a spoon round and round in a jar of honey, the honey will start to rotate with the spoon. And the same thing happens with a rotating massive object. If it rotates fast enough, if it's massive enough, it'll pull space and time around with it so much that you effectively get a little loop forming. What's sometimes called a closed space-time loop. And the result of that is that in principle, you have a mechanism where you could, by traveling around that rotating cylinder, move backwards in time. There are other potential methods, often described using something called a wormhole, something you see in science fiction quite a lot, which is a mechanism, if you like, in theory, connecting 2 points in space and time. And be able to effectively jump from one to the other. But in practice, we don't know that wormholes actually practically exist. We've never seen one. We don't know how to make one. And even if we could make one, all the physics suggests that getting through one would make it collapse, trying to go through it. So it's a very difficult problem. And arguably, the neutron star cylinder is the simpler approach, even though you think, the idea of just going out, collecting maybe 10 stars, pulling them together into a cylinder, rotating them at something near the speed of light, that is not the kind of stuff we're going to be doing in the next few years.
How about the LHC, the Large Hadron Collider? I was reading up on it, and there was possibilities of miniature black holes being created through some of the experiments. And you touch on in your book that might be another way, maybe, but obviously the gravitational forces would just pull everything. As far as I know, that black holes are the only thing that could bend light. A lot of things refract light, but a black hole is the only thing that could bend light. So along those lines, the LHC and black holes, what's about that for time travel possibility, or at least helping that engineering along?
When it's not actually black holes have any particular capability in terms of bending light. Anything with mass bends light. The more mass it has, the more it will bend the light. So, of course, basically what it does is twist space and time around it. It warps the space. And the light is just traveling in a straight line through space, but because the space itself is twisted, the light then does not go through the straight line as far as we see it. It actually goes around it. And you can see this happening when you look out into space. Ordinary stars do this. Planets do it, but they just don't do it very much because they don't have a big enough mass. The interesting thing about black holes is that they concentrate that mass so that you can get very close to it. You can't get within inches of the center of mass of a star, but you can get very close to the center of mass of a black hole. And so the warping effect is much stronger. But of course, that does still depend on it having the mass of a star. If there were tiny black holes created in the Large Hadron Collider, which we don't have any evidence of it happening yet, then they would only have a tiny amount of mass. Just because something is a black hole doesn't mean it's a sort of immense, voracious thing pulling stuff in. It has exactly the same gravitational pull as an ordinary body of the same mass. And these tiny black holes that we're talking about would have the mass, of a flea or less. So we're not talking about something that is going to have any great effect on space and time.
Well, that's interesting. That's cleared that up, because I imagine that it's this huge, infinite dark tunnel that could attract anything and nothing could get away from it. What about on the quantum level? Because you do touch upon what makes up light, acting like waves and particles, and the double slit experiment, which really blows my mind when we talk about that. And quantum entanglement, maybe a possibility of messages from the future using quantum entanglement, that sort of thing.
It's certainly something that intrigues physicists. Essentially, quantum entanglement is a way of linking two or more quantum particles with each other, so they effectively become a single thing. And you can separate those particles to any distance, and if you make a change to one particle, that change is reflected in the other. Unfortunately, those changes that we're talking about, these changes in quantum state, are not things we can control. So it's not a case of, I can switch one particle to red, as it were, and the other particle goes red. It's that the particle will switch to either red or green randomly, and the other one will switch to the opposite. So if mine's red, I now know the other one's green, but I have no way of controlling the way it switches. And it's very frustrating because this does seem to happen instantly. And if you can send a message instantly, there is a mechanism by which you could, in principle, send it backwards in time just by using special relativity. So it's an interesting possibility. And as I say, lots of physicists have spent lots of time playing around trying to find ways to do this. But the reality is, as yet, they've not discovered a way to be able to control what's being sent. It's just, if you like, a random message that's being sent. And so that, unfortunately, we can't send back next week's lottery results to this week.
There haven't been any grandfather serial killers that I'm aware of. So let's now talk paradoxes. What are they? And could also you tell us about the mind-bending, hopefully I've pronounced this right, Polchinski billiard table paradox?
Okay, so if you can travel back in time, it opens up the possibility of weird things happening. And when we talk about paradoxes in this context, we're really just saying something that doesn't seem like it makes any sense to us. And the best known is the grandfather paradox. For some, I don't really know why it is grandfather. It would work just as well with a parent. But basically the idea is, if you could go back in time, what would happen if you killed, say, your grandfather before you were born? Before your parents were born. So that you weren't born, and if you weren't born, you wouldn't have gone back in time. If you didn't go back in time, they wouldn't be killed. So you would be able to go back in time. You get into a type of logic loop with that. If you could stop yourself doing it, then you would be able to do it, but then you just stop yourself doing it. So that's one example, if you like, of the kind of paradoxes that appear to arise if you could travel backwards in time. Another example would be, if I took a copy of my book back in time to before I wrote it and gave it to myself, I could just copy out that book and send it to the publisher. Now, who wrote it? Where did that book come from? Because I didn't write it. I just brought my copy back from the future, typed it into the computer and sent it off to the publisher. It's emerged from nowhere.
Hi, I'm Yuri Penchenkov, a former soldier in Russian military and now CEO of TeenageSitting.com. Are you tired of being wrong all the time or feeling out of touch with a teenager who clearly knows it all? Here at TeenageSitting.com, we offer kenneling at competitive rates that will allow you to get away for an evening or a much-needed parent-only vacation. Our services include work experience and rent-paying simulations to stimulate the minds of your easily offended kennel teenager. Use the promo code SlickPodcast22 to get a hormonal door-slamming 5% off of our sitting service, or visit our website, TeenageSitting.com, because I said so.
Sleep Podcast. The Sleep Podcast. Yeah, it's a Sleep Podcast. Truly unforgettable topic. This is Sleep Podcast.
So some people think that if these paradoxes were enabled, either the universe would find some way to stop them working, or there might be some kind of quantum effect where we're actually moving into, if you like, an alternative quantum universe. So it's a different past me and future me. And as a result of that, you wouldn't have that problem, because it would be me, if you like, in a different quantum universe writing the book, passing it back to me in my universe. I then copy it out and send it. But frankly, with all these kinds of things, what we're looking at really is saying what it means is we really just don't know what would happen. And we have no way of predicting that without actually trying this kind of thing out. The thing you mentioned in terms of the Polchinski billiard table paradox, it is quite mind-boggling. It's quite difficult to describe, to be honest. This was a physicist called Joe Polchinski, who was trying to think of a simple experiment that would have the same kind of issue as the grandfather paradox. So what he suggested is that you have a little thing somehow that will send a ball back in time, just a short amount of time, that you can put on a billiard table, something like a wormhole or something that links now to a second before, say. You send a ball through that, it comes out the other end and hits itself before it goes into the wormhole, knocking it off its path, and so it can go through. And again, like the grandfather paradox, if it knocks itself off the path, it won't go through, so it won't knock itself off the path, so it can go through. And if it does go through, it will knock itself off the path, and so on. It gets into one of those loops. And that's how it started. But some other physicists, notably Kip Thorne, who's a real expert in general relativity, pointed out that the ball could hit itself and not actually totally prevent itself from going through. And if it did that, it would then be on a different course. So even if it looked like it was going to knock itself out of going through, it would then knock itself back in again. And effectively, exactly the same starting conditions could end up with either it knocking itself out or it allowing itself to go through. And as they looked at this kind of thought experiment, it seemed more and more likely that you get in a bit of like a quantum-like state, where there are just many possible outcomes from the same starting position. But I say in the end, when physics gets itself into one of these tangles, it really just emphasizes that we don't know what the outcome is, that our current description of what's happening isn't sufficient. The theory isn't sufficient to describe what will happen, and we need an experiment to demonstrate what really is going to happen.
It will be kind of like the rocket being launched, and if it was possible to send messages back in time, maybe you got one a week later before the rocket launch saying, don't launch the rocket. That would be a real dilemma. Throughout your book, most theorists agree that if the machine... because I was just thinking, as you were saying, the ball knocking itself out of alignment to go back through say the tunnel. I just thought that if a rocket had launched or you were going to launch a rocket in a week and you got the message back, don't launch the rocket, and you didn't launch the rocket, then where the hell did that message come from? So that to me would spell out it's the splitting of a timeline. I can't think of anything other than that to describe it. Alternative realities, maybe that would be the universe's way of not overloading, like plugging your computer into a 24 volt rather than a 12 volt. If you've got an inverter, say in your camper van, plug it into a 24 volt, you're going to overload the system. 12 volt, it will work. Throughout your book, most theorists agree that if it's a machine, if you construct a machine to travel back in time, the earliest you could go back would be to the switch on and first operational date. Why is that?
It really just reflects how the general theory of relativity enables you to travel back in time. All the time traveling that comes from relativity is looking at ways effectively that you can change the flow of time. It's not saying you can jump like you do in a science fiction story with the TARDIS or whatever, from now to a particular point in the future or a particular point in the past. It's changing the way that time flows so that you can move into the future or into the past. And if you think about it, the way that general relativity lets you go into the past is, if you imagine, for instance, I've got a special time box, and general relativity gives me a way of making time flow slower in that box, and then somehow I get into the box. That's effectively how you get into the past. It's a way of changing the relative flow of time between you and the universe. And unfortunately, taking that approach, there's no way to kind of wind back time and go backwards. It's more a case of we can freeze time for the universe as far as we're concerned, and then jump into that slowed time universe. So the earliest you can realistically go back to is the point when the machine was first initiated. And that doesn't enable you, say, to go back and see the dinosaurs or some great historical event, unless there are aliens out there who've already built such a time machine and you're making use of that. But as far as our construction goes, unfortunately, the general idea from general relativity is that you don't go back past where the machine was first switched on.
Because the other paradoxical thought that I had whilst reading your book, or actually before your book, that if we invent time travel, say, even in 1 million years' time, that potentially means that we've always had time travel. But what you've just told me there completely knocks that out of the park. That would not be the case, because it's only the switch on date. So future people in 1 million years' time could go back to year zero, which means we've always had time travel.
From our future, if you look, at some point, somebody has to invent the technology and actually construct that technology.
Correct.
And if that point where that technology is constructed is the point you can get back to at the earliest. So unless somebody was around in year zero constructing that machine, you aren't going to be able to get back to it.
That's right, yeah. So before I'd read your book, I thought to myself, if they don't invent time travel for 1 million years, as soon as that switch on happens, then we could have potentially always had time travel, because the time travelers being around from year dot, they could travel back to them. But having now read your book, that wouldn't be possible. It has to be from the switch on date, unless, of course, something in nature going back to wormholes, this, that, and the other, allows that form of travel. And that would have to be in nature, in physics, nothing created by us ourselves to allow that to happen. Would you agree with that?
Either in nature or, as I said, if you're happy with the concept of aliens, that there could be aliens who had done that earlier.
Yeah, I think so. I don't think we could accelerate, as you point out, to the speed of light using gasoline explosive propulsion, i.e. a rocket engine. You write in your book that a space shuttle, for example, weighing 100 tons, traveling at 90% the speed of light, would require the combined power of every power station in the United States for 250 years. As the speed and mass increases, then so does the need for more power. That is an incredible amount of power. Wouldn't nuclear power be the answer for our potentially time-traveling shuttle?
Well, certainly nuclear power is better than making use of fuel as we do at the moment. The problems are twofold, really. One is that you need to get an incredibly high amount of energy onto your spaceship, or somehow to power it remotely, and there are vague possibilities of doing that. But assuming it is on the spaceship, then there's such a thing as, if you like, energy density. the amount of stuff you have to carry to have a certain amount of energy. And say petrol has quite good energy density, but hydrogen has a bit more, which is what is used in the big rocket engines. Nuclear power has considerably more, but the most energy dense thing we know of actually is antimatter, and antimatter is probably the best way of carrying the amount of energy that you require. You also have to have some way to convert that energy into movement. Just because you've got some energy doesn't mean it's going to move. And the way a rocket typically works is by throwing something out of the back. So you throw something out the back, that pushes you forward. It's Newton's first law of motion. And that's fine. But of course, you then need to carry with you the stuff you throw out the back. And with a conventional rocket, what you're carrying with you is the fuel. And the fuel itself is what's thrown out of the back, and it is the exhaust, and that's what pushes you forward. If you're going to use nuclear fuel, typically what you might do is generate either heat or energy, and then that has to energize something else. So you still have to carry what's called reaction mass, something to push out the back. So it's looking for ways to accelerate up at a high speed to a good proportion of the speed of light is not easy. It's certainly a huge challenge, but we certainly could do a lot better than we do at the moment with our current rockets.
Solar sails, or as you touch on in your book, making the fuel as you go along, that might be another potential source of fuel, but it's the increased mass approaching the speed of light. But as you're putting, as you said, 90%, it's almost, well, as it is now, it is an impossibility. But as you approach that speed, then your mass increases. Could you just break that down for me?
Yeah, we're back to Einstein's special theory of relativity, which, if you remember, links space and time. And that tells us that as something moves, the faster it moves, the more this effect comes in. Three things happen. So basically, time slows down as far as you appear from somewhere else. So looking at you from the Earth, we see your clocks slowing down. The second thing that happens is your mass increases. And the faster you go, the bigger it is. And that's arguably why you can't get past the speed of light, because as you approach the speed of light, your mass becomes closer and closer to being infinite. And the other thing that happens that isn't particularly relevant here, but it's quite fun, is that your size in the direction of travel shrinks. So you get, if you like, flatter and flatter in the direction of travel. None of this you would experience yourself, because as far as you're concerned, you're not moving. You wouldn't see any of this happening on the spaceship. But looking at you from Earth, and as far as the need for, having the right amount of energy goes, you would still find that you're having to overcome this increase in mass to be able to actually get the thing moving.
Those who might seek next week's lottery numbers, briefly visiting next Friday, although those who may for some reason try to change history to their own advantage, in your opinion, would the universe allow such things, or does, for lack of a better word, karma operate in all dimensions to redress such a interfered with chronological balance? In theory, anyway.
It's an interesting one. I mean, certainly Stephen Hawking believed it shouldn't be possible at one point, and referred to what he called a time causal operating principle, or time cop. The idea being that basically the universe would find some way to prevent this kind of thing happening. It's all a bit fuzzy. It's not really physics. It is kind of metaphysics when you start thinking about something like that. It's just when you think about the paradoxes, the things like the grandfather paradox, or where my book would come from if I sent it back in time, it clearly feels wrong. And we want some way that the universe would cope with that, if you like, some way that it would fit with our expectation that effect follows cause, if you like, rather than effect coming before the cause. And because of that, I think most people would say the chances are either things wouldn't work how we would expect them to, or, as you've already mentioned, what we could do is have some kind of parallel universe effect. So one of the interpretations of quantum physics, the so-called many worlds hypothesis, suggests that every time effectively something happens to a quantum particle, then there are two possible ways it could go. Say, for instance, both actually happen, and the universe splits into one part where it happens one way, one party happens the other way. So there are many, many parallel universes that we, if you like, our experience universe jumps between. And if that was the case, you could imagine, as I mentioned, that the traveler in time would be in effectively a different universe as a result of what has happened. And so you wouldn't actually have all these kind of effects working the way that you think they are. You'd still feel it was happening. So for instance, I could send my book back in time and the me in the past could then copy it out. But those were two separate me's, the one who wrote the book and the one it was sent back to, rather than being the same me at a different point in the timeline. And that probably is our best hope for an explanation. But until, frankly, we can sensibly try out this kind of thing and see what happens, it's always a bit of a guess. It's not really something we can say, it's going to happen like this or it'll happen like that. We just don't have the information to be able to choose.
I've always pondered what time is. And as far as I'm concerned, my conclusions would be a mechanism for stopping everything happening all at once. What do you think? And I know a lot of people have pondered this, what time is, but I just think it's a separator. I'm not a scientist, obviously, but that's the best thing I can come up with. What would you describe time as?
Yeah, I mean, that not a way of preventing everything happening at the same time. I think this concept goes back at least to the 1930s. I think it was used in the phrase was used, or a phrase like that was used in a science fiction story back in the 30s. That's the job of time, if you like. The thing is, I think part of the problem with time is that it is several things that we kind of pull together. So yes, it is. It's what clocks measure. That's one thing you might think of as time. It's almost a coordinate system. So just like space, you can say where something is in space, then time gives us, if you like, another dimensional coordinate to measure things on. And our subjective time, the way we experience the world, is yet another thing. That we experience time flowing in very different ways. It's not something that's to do with time travel, but there's no doubt whatsoever that we experience it differently. We all go to sleep and effectively wake up having suddenly jumped hours into the future, apart from any time we were dreaming. So subjectively, time flows in a different way. But how we see time is really more about philosophy than it is about physics. Whether you think of time, I've used the word flowing quite a lot. Some physicists will tell you time doesn't flow, that if you like, it's like just a block of all time, all space. We don't move through it. We just look at different points in that block. But it can be easier, I think, to understand a feeling of what time's about, to think about something that is flowing, because that's something we naturally relate to well. But say in the end, I think it's more philosophy than it is physics.
What would be the use of a time machine, taking into account the paradoxes and separate timelines? Could you think of any use of a time machine?
Well, it's a difficult one to say. I mean, the paradoxes come in when we change things. So assuming that the paradoxes can't happen because they feel like they're somehow going against the way the universe wants to be, it wouldn't stop us in principle being able to say, if we were somehow to communicate with the past, to somehow see into the past. So you can obviously see that, the time travel of that sort would have a huge potential in terms of understanding history better, or even being able to send messages either way and communicate, which in themselves have some slight potential for paradoxes, I must admit, if you send information, because again, with them making a change. But us being able to look into the past isn't changing the past. And I think that if we ever did have any backward pointing time travel, then the most likely thing is that we might be able to see things in the past without actually interacting with them. And as I say, I think that would open up all sorts of possibilities. And if you think about what you would like to do in terms of time travel, yes, going back and doing things might be fun and creating these weird paradoxes. But I think we would also benefit hugely if we could actually see through time and see into the past.
Because we can observe light from certain stars that could be millions of years. The light have been traveling and the stars are long since gone. That, to me, would be an observable feat of time travel. Obviously, not ourselves doing it, but a natural one anyway.
Oh, that's right. I mean, even with your naked eye, the thing you can see in the sky furthest away with your naked eye is probably the Andromeda Galaxy, which is about 2.5 million light years away. So we see that as it was 2.5 million years ago in the past. It hasn't, I'm sure, but it could have just totally exploded for all we know, and we wouldn't know for 2.5 million years. And modern telescopes are looking back billions of years into the past. We see things as they were in the past because, as you say, light takes time to travel to us. That's fascinating in its own right, but in a sense, what we're really interested in as well is ourselves, being a fairly self-centered animal. And what would be harder is to use the natural ways to somehow see into the past of the Earth. And I think if we did have some kind of time machine, it would be appealing to, as I say, to have some way to look into our own history, to look at historical events and actually see what really happened rather than what the history books say.
Okay, then, let's say theoretically then you have a time travel, and this is really my second to last question. Where would you go, or should I say, when would you go and why? And you can only have one trip, but you'll be safe, so you can go anywhere or when. Where would you go?
It is a really difficult one. Interestingly, one chapter in the book is about an American physicist who's done a lot of work on time travel. And the reason he got into time travel, got interested in it, was that his father died when he was young. And he wanted to be able to go back and see his father. He knew now, as he got into physics, he knew that it actually wouldn't be practically possible, but it's what inspired him. And I guess, as somebody, I lost my father in 1984, long time ago now, and I would love, I think, most of all, to be able to go back and talk to him again, more than, all the usual standard stuff about wanting to go back and, I don't know, see the crucifixion or see dinosaurs or whatever people want to go back to see. I think that personal connection is something that for me would be most important.
Yeah. Painful but personal. I totally get that. Well, that's up to the top of the hour, Brian. I'd like to thank you for your time today. Before we wrap up, could you tell my listeners where we can find you, your books, and any events that are up and coming we should know about?
Yep, it's quite simple. So my website is brianclegg.net. That's BRIANCLEGG.net. And if you go there, you'll find all of that, and also things like links to my Twitter and Facebook, as well as you say, events that are coming up. And thankfully this year, it looks like we are going to go back to having more science festivals and other events that you can find people talking at, and also details, of course, about all my books.
Brian Clegg, thank you.
Thanks very much.
And that was the Brian Clegg interview. There were so many more questions I'd like to have put forward in this cast, but Brian's time for this interview was limited. And there were also questions I thought of after that should have definitely been put forward. One that comes to mind would be of relativity, that is to say, time being relative to the observer. Albert Einstein explained this concept as sitting next to a pretty girl for an hour, and that hour passing very quickly, at least for the guy. The girl could possibly think that the time was dragging painfully by. My analogy would be placing my hand on a hot radiator for 30 seconds. Those 30 painful seconds would seem, from my perspective, to pass incredibly slowly, but for the bemused observer of my stupidity, it would be at the normal future approaching velocity of 1 second per second. The ability to travel up and down the timeline is certainly appealing and worrying also. I think that the universe is reluctant to bestow such a power on any mortal. Having said that, I believe that memory, if used correctly, is time travel in the full sense of the word. Our dreams also are conduit for such journeys, albeit dreams being unpredictable, but nonetheless a transportation to other times and places. I personally don't think we will ever physically be able to travel the timeline, due to our restricted encasement in these bodies of ours. But, and here's the thing, I think we could certainly send our consciousness on a timeline navigation experience, or when the technology is available, it could certainly happen and be more feasible. Therefore, we've become passive observers. But, and it's a big but, those who would undertake such travels would have to have the integrity of a saint. And maybe the universe, or Mr. and Mrs. God if you like, wouldn't allow such a peeking around the curtain, because having such knowledge is just too much responsibility for mere mortals, and is reserved for higher beings such as the creators themselves. So it would seem that we only have the past that we can't affect, but should definitely remember and learn by. The here and now, which many of us forget to appreciate or relish and make the most of, and the future, whether it be 1,000 years or tomorrow. If we live for the now with peace, love and understanding, it will be a beautiful tomorrow. If we choose not to, well, then fill in the blank. How to Build a Time Machine is an excellent read and a really in-depth look at the science, far more than we could discuss here today. And I really encourage anyone who is chronologically curious to read it. My thanks to Brian for his time today, and also for the time you have taken listening to this cast, and I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. Give the show a like and subscribe also if you'd be so kind. Leave a comment below or send the show an email, theslkpodcast@gmail.com. But either way, please keep them kind. You can find and follow the show on YouTube, Facebook and Twitter, and all the usual podcast platforms. The SLK Podcast is having a website built, and that should be up and running in a month or so. And on the site there will be past episodes, guest profiles, and there will definitely be a merch shop also, where you can purchase hoodies, t-shirts, mugs, hats and much, much more. However, you will not be able to purchase a mask. Just saying. And so, my friends, it's time for me to go. Until next time, stay safe, be happy and certainly not afraid. Bye.
Slick Podcast. Keeping it real and always keeping it groovy.